everyone, Dr. Jason Old here, surfer, historian, world traveler, and your host of the Surfing Historian podcast. This season, we'll be diving deeper into the nuanced world of surfing and examining the historical, cultural, philosophical, and even scientific elements of the sport we're all stoked on. So let's paddle out together and ride through the world of academia. Joining me today from Northern California is fellow surfing historian Dr. Steve Estes. Steve's a history professor at Sonoma State University, and today we'll be talking about his book, Surfing the South, The Search for Waves and the People Who Ride Them. This book explores the varying ways that surfing intersects with business, music, race, gender, environmentalism, and even politics in the American South. To fully explore this unsung surfing world, Steve undertook a journey that stretched more than 2,300 miles, traveling from the coast of Texas to Ocean City, Maryland. Along the way, he interviewed and surfed alongside dozens of people, wealthy and poor, men and women, black and white, all of whom opened up about their lives, how they saw themselves, and what the sport means to them. They also talked about race, class, the environment, and how surfing has shaped their identities. Steve's book can be found at surfinghistorian.com. Like Aaron's book, it's featured on our homepage. But while you're there, don't forget to check out our awesome merch, as well as all the amazing surfing organizations you can get involved with. I'm super stoked to have you on to share this book with our listeners. Steve actually gave me a copy of the book at a conference at San Diego State University. So I'm excited to get a chance to pick your brain about this intriguing book. But before we get started, I want to personally thank you, Steve, as well as our listeners, for being part of this episode of The Surfing Historian.
Thanks for having me, Jason. I really appreciate it. I'm totally psyched to be on the podcast. I got into the research for this book totally selfishly because I wanted to get scholarly credit for taking a surf trip. Let's just be super frank about it. And it was that, and more. Like, I was very, very excited during the trips. I went about 2,300 miles with my daughter, who was 11 and 12 at the time, and so it was such a blast to travel through the South surfing and interviewing people and riding waves. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny, Steve. I can completely relate, and I think most of us in this, what we're calling critical surf studies field. I certainly won't speak for everybody, but myself, I got into it because I love surfing, but I do love academia, and it was a bit of a way to get paid to surf, and so yeah, I completely can relate to your reason behind doing something like that. It's I think it was my dad I was talking to as I was doing some of my research, and particularly Nicaragua. I was like, well, I want to be down there so I can surf every day. And it was almost like I leveraged that I had to do research to justify being there. So absolutely, man. But in doing that, in taking your, quote unquote surf trip, you've put together a really amazing book. And I'm, looking forward to getting into it. You are actually, just for the listeners, you're from the South originally, correct?
Yeah, I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. And I always joke with people that in Charleston, that makes me a Yankee because I'm from North Carolina. But I think the growing up in the South definitely helped with the book. But as your listeners will hear, I don't sound like I'm Southern so much anymore. I have, if I drink a bunch of beer or hang out with my brothers, my accent comes back out, and I do say y'all, but I have lived in California for almost 20 years now, and so my accent has migrated from Charleston accent to Northern California surf bum accent. So you'll hear that as we talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm I think many of the listeners may already know this, but I'm originally from the Virginia Beach. I was born in Virginia Beach, but kind of grew up around Virginia Beach in the Outer Banks. But yeah, I having also lived in Southern California, or lived in California. I was in Southern California. I feel like I've lost that Southern accent myself as well. Even though living in Florida, I mean, it is part of the South, and I know there's some parts in the book where you talk about, I think, the surfers from the Space Coast don't think they're Southern or something like that. But we'll get more into that as we dive into this book. But I actually want to start with a question that I found personally fascinating, because our friend Scott Latterman has written a really incredible book, Empire and Waves, which you reference. And he even gives, if I'm not mistaken, a really great review of the book, on perhaps even on the book. But anyways, I want to talk about, you talk about in the book, and you do reference Scott's book, about how surfing in the US, particularly in the US South, was spread through military. And I'd like for you, just for our listeners, because that seems like a weird way for surfing to spread. But for those who are unfamiliar with how that would work, I'd just like for you to maybe explain what you meant by that, and how surfing proliferated as a result of, let's say, U.S. military bases within the United States, and particularly the South.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it definitely does connect to Scott's book. So one of the things, Scott's book, as you said, is called Empire and Waves, and everybody should read it who listens to this podcast. It's amazing. So, just that's a shameless plug for our buddy's book, but it is a really, really smart book. And one of the things that Scott argues in Empire and Waves, as the title would suggest, is that the U.S., as the U.S. military presence went throughout the world, especially in the Cold War, that coincided with the birth and growth of modern surfing, right? I mean, the fact that we're in Hawaii in the first place as the United States is a legacy of that early wave of colonialism, or neo-colonialism in the case of the United States. So surfing came back the other direction from Hawaii as a naval base and an imperial outpost of the United States, and then spread to California. And from there, what I found out in the book, and this surprised me, Jason, I was totally shocked by this, that the military was the vehicle. Like, I had assumed that, surf music like the Beach Boys or Jan and Dean, and surf movies, Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon, those kinds of things, and mass culture in the early 60s had been the main vehicle for the virus of surfing to spread throughout the United States. And they were very big parts of it, don't get me wrong. But it turned out that these military bases that have a higher percentage in the South because of congressional seniority of Southern politicians, that's where they put the bases, because that would bring jobs and money to their local constituents. And then in the 60s, as people in the military rotated through Hawaii and California and then came back to the South, they brought surfing with them, along with a whole host of other things that connected the South to what I call the Sun Belt, which is really from Virginia to where you grew up to California, and you could include Hawaii in that, actually. So that was the way that it was. Through these kind of cross deployments, you had this pollination of surfing throughout the southeastern coasts of Navy bases and Air Force bases and Coast Guard bases in particular.
Yeah, thanks. And my granddad, he wasn't a surfer, but he was in the Navy and was stationed in Hawaii. He was in Vietnam, and then he eventually ended in in Virginia Beach. And so so I'm very familiar with that. Like I said, he didn't surf, but as I was reading your book, and you were making reference to Scott's book, and then talking about how all these bases were aided the proliferation of surfing in the South, I was like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And so, thanks for that, a bit of a back history, if you will, of that. The other thing you mentioned in your response was music. And I personally think your book offers a little music history, even though it's not something you highlight in its bio. But you talked about the Beach Boys, which I think many of the more hardcore surfers of Southern California saw them as kooks. The John Seversons who founded Surfer Magazine, basically the Dana Point Mafia, and many of the others. So how do you see, so let's explore that music history that you make mention of. How do you see the evolution of music from, say, the Beach Boys, that was in Dick Dell and his Deltones and all that was considered quote unquote surf music? How do we see that traveling, if you will, with surfing, or evolving with surfing? And how does that play out in the South? Did you notice anything when it came to that with music and surfing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so first of all, I am a musician. I play bass in two bands here in San Francisco right now. So music is a huge part of my life, as much a part as surfing is. And so to me, they're very similar. And I'm going to do a digression and then I'll answer your question. Later on in the book, I was having this conversation with a guy in Melbourne, Florida, and on the Atlantic coast. And through that conversation, I started to make this theory, and I'll put that in scare quotes, of shortboarding and longboarding being the guitar and bass of surfing. So the longboard is the baseline. You kind of, it takes a little bit more. They both take grace, but I would say longboarding is really all about grace and style, and not about shredding. And guitar and shortboarding is more about shredding, more about doing radical maneuvers, soloing on the wave, etc. So anyway, I wanted to just make that silly theory out there. But the other thing I would say, direct answer to your question is, yeah, a lot of the people I interviewed grew up in the 60s and 70s, because I was interviewing longtime surfers in all these places. And so they came of age at the same time as that, what you call, I think accurately, kook surf music. And that definitely is, I mean, the Beach Boys, I think one of them actually surfed, and they weren't, but they became swept up in this surf craze. I think there are two things I would say. One, there was an organic Southern surf music scene that never really launched anyone into the national scene. No one from Southern states that played in surf bands made it onto the pop charts, but they did have, especially in Florida, a circuit where they would play at these beach clubs all up and down the east coast of Florida, and also the Gulf Coast too. And the other thing I would say is that there's some strange connections to what would become psychedelic rock from Southern surfing. So for instance, in Daytona Beach and Jacksonville in northern Florida, the Allman Brothers come out of that scene. They went to school with a lot of the people I interviewed. They weren't themselves surfers, but they were certainly influenced by surfers and surf music in ways that I don't think a lot of people know. And even Tom Petty comes out of that same scene, and Leonard Skinner comes out of Jacksonville. So there is this funny connection with Southern rock and surfing that I don't talk too much about in the book, but it definitely is one of the untold stories in there.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. You don't promote the book as a book that offers any, real music history, but in a sense it does, whether it's the impacts of, let's say, surf culture on the Allman Brothers, of course, Tom Petty being from Florida, Leonard Skinner, of course, from Jacksonville, a beach city, and that had a surf culture as well. But so yeah, I really appreciate it. As I was reading through it, I enjoyed that you were making those connections with music that many of us like and listen to, and it's how it was influenced, perhaps sometimes just subtly, by the surfing culture of the time. And so, yeah, thank you for sort of elaborating on that. But I actually want to go ahead and just get right on into the book itself, because we've been sort of dancing around some of the themes in it. And but I want to start out with the fact that you took this trip with your daughter. And so how did you manage to convince her to go along on this trip with you?
It's a good question. I start the book off with a joke about how my daughter was the last person I really thought about taking on this trip. I have surf buddies from all different parts of my life, all the different places I've lived: North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, California. And I tried to get some of them to go with me on this trip, and they all begged off. And so I thought, oh, my daughter is into the ocean for sure, and she's just starting to learn how to surf, so maybe I'll take her. And then a buddy of mine said, who's wiser than I am, even though we're the same age, he said, if you don't take her now, she's going to hate you in a year, so she won't want to spend any time with you. So it turned out he was right about that. Although we're on the other side of that mostly because she's going to college now. So it was phenomenal to have her along. It made for some difficulties in terms of logistics, because especially the first summer that we did, I broke this trip up into 2 summers. And the first summer, she was still relatively young, like 11 years old. And so there were times when she didn't want to go on an interview, or she couldn't go on an interview for some reason. And so I had to really, really think about that. But when she did come on the interviews, it actually helped a lot. And so one of the things that we may talk more about later is that when I interviewed women surfers, because my daughter was with me, they would talk directly to her, actually. And it became this way of passing the torch from one generation of female surfers to the next generation of female surfers. And to me, that was really, really beautiful. It was so nice to see my daughter find these role models in older women who had been surfing for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. And so I really appreciated that part of having her along. There were many other things I liked, but that was one thing where it definitely helped the book.
Yeah, and I noticed that, and I sort of laughed a bit as I was reading the book, and it's a really easy read, by the way, and just a fun read too. I mean, obviously, I'm probably a little biased, given that I'm from the South, and so I know virtually all the places you talked about, and but it was one of those stories where I was like, yeah, I'm glad Steve did this, because there really isn't a sort of history, if you will, of the South in this. You did something that didn't already exist, and I appreciate you for doing that, and that gives us something awesome to talk about. So, but let's get into that dynamic there, that gender dynamic. You mentioned that your daughter, the way she was able to interact during these interviews with female surfers would have been a different dynamic had it been you and these female surfers. And I know you mentioned that in the book, and you just said that, but I'm actually curious to know sort of the content of the interviews, in that how were women's experiences surfing during, say, I guess you started in the 60s and moving forward, as compared maybe to the experience of women in California. And I don't know how much research you've done on that, but specifically the experience of women surfers in the South during this time. What was their experience like?
That's a good question, Jason. I think that there are a lot of parallels to the challenges that women surfers faced in California to those same challenges in the South. There are a couple of things that helped Southern women survive or succeed in ways that their California cousins did not. And I think one way is that the barriers to entry are pretty low in the South. The water's warm, the waves are relatively friendly and small. And so learning how to surf, whether you're a young boy or a young girl, is not a traumatic experience. It is a pleasurable experience. So that I think is very different from some of the more cutthroat surf culture especially in Southern California in the 60s, by the 60s, when waves were really, there was territorialism in much more so in Southern California than there was anywhere on the Southern coast. And that territorialism intersected with sexism in a way that really hurt women's participation in the sport. But the way that it was similar, that Southern women faced similar problems, is just in sports in general in the 60s. This is right at the beginning of second wave feminism, or maybe right before second wave feminism hits the United States. And so women talked about how they were doing a boys' sport when they were surfing. And so I interviewed one woman who surfed in the 1966 national championship that was held in Southern California. She's from Daytona Beach, Florida. And there were pictures of her in Sports Illustrated and Life magazine, but they were not of her surfing. They were of her in a bikini on the beach. And she was a really good surfer. And so that was true for a lot of women surfers throughout the 60s and even into the 70s. They would get in the surf mags, but they would not get in the surf mags with a shot of them actually doing a cutback or pulling into a barrel. It was always, always, always a bikini beach shot. And one of the women I talked to from the Gulf Coast of Florida said the first time she had a shot of her actually on a wave in a surf magazine, she actually screamed for joy when she opened the magazine, because she was just so shocked that they had put it in there.
Yeah, I mean, the objectification of women in surfing, and then I would say sports more broadly, is certainly something that there are scholars out there looking at analyzing those things and bringing it to light in a more critical way, let's say, particularly within the sport of surfing. I know Krista Comer does that with Surfer Girls in the New World Order. And, she and a number of others, Rebecca Olive over in Australia, and looking at, this idea of liberated women surfers, more of a modern, these young girls that are out surfing now, like looking at how that has evolved over time to where surfing and perhaps feminism have overlapped to create these more liberated women surfers. And so, yeah, thanks for talking about that. I really appreciate that. And I guess sort of more along this gender discussion, in terms of your interviews with these women, did they talk at all about not just how I don't know if they use the word objectified or whatever, but did they talk about how the sport evolved? I know you just mentioned, it went from showing just women in bikinis to now a photo of this individual on a wave, and she was stoked. Was there anything else they talked about in terms of how women's surfing had evolved over these decades?
Yeah. One of the people that I talked to on the Space Coast of Florida talked about the transition from twin fins to thrusters, and in a way that male professional surfers would definitely recognize. She went she was surfing for, I think, Quiet Flight, and they were making her boards, and she said she was kind of complaining about the twin fins that they had made for her. Yeah, they're really loose, but they didn't have enough drive down the line, and she had seen these thrusters and knew that guys were riding them, and worked with her shaper to create a thruster that was perfect for her. She was a very serious competitive surfer. In fact, she went to Hawaii, and one of the things that she said was that she faced more sexism in Hawaii on the North Shore than she had in Florida, and she was surprised by that. And she called out, I'm going to mention a name, I probably shouldn't do that, but she called out Johnny Boy Gomes, who was one of this kind of like bad boy surfers in the 1980s, who specifically was like, you don't really belong here on the North Shore. And if you've ever seen women surfers surf on the Space Coast of Florida, you know that they rip, man. And so, she definitely belonged there, and she didn't let that stop her. But that was one of the stories she told. And so in a way, their stories were universal in that the evolution of women surfing charted, point for point with the evolution of men surfing, going from longboarding to, the kind of lightning bolt era, single fin with more maneuverability, into the twin fin era, into the thruster era. But they also face these other things in addition to those, that design evolution and that performance evolution. Let me say one last thing about that. Last week, I was surfing here in San Francisco, and I saw this woman big wave surfer. She's just a big wave surfer, but her name is Bianca Valenti. And you were talking about how surfing and feminism kind of overlap. And Bianca is part of this crew of hard charging big wave surfers. Like, she surfs Maverick, she surfs Puerto Escondido in Mexico. I was actually starstruck, to be frank, And so I was just chatting with her a little bit and thinking, God, this lady rides waves I would never even think or dream about paddling out in, And so, I mean, partly that she's younger than me, but partly it's just that she's more of a badass than I am. So it's cool to see that women like Bianca pushing for equal pay in WSL, equal pay in the big wave circuit and Mavericks, and getting it. So yeah, that's the kind of coda to that story.
Yeah, the evolution of women's sports in general, surfing fits in that larger story of, these women surfers pushing for equal pay. It's this, same scenario with women's soccer players. And if I'm not mistaken, some of the guys from the men's World Cup team essentially agreed to making sure women were compensated equally. So you do see that trend happening, and it's really nice, actually. But yeah, I completely understand what you're talking about with some of these women. And I'll give a funny story really quickly before we get into. I want to talk a little bit about your experience with race in the South in surfing. But I remember a few years back, my buddy's daughter, he has 3 daughters. They absolutely rip, and I remember saying to him, man, I think Valentina surfs better than I do now. And she was, I think, 13 or 14 or something. And he's like, yeah, she's been surfing better than you for like 2 years now. And, so I feel your pain on that. I'm like, all right, that's fine, whatever. But yeah, you're seeing these young women inspired by their predecessors who really were paving the way for what is taking place today. And it's, again, it's nice to see that you've in your book highlighted some of the strides, in a sense, and tribulations, triumphs, tribulations, in your book as well, with women surfers in the South. And so with that, I want to segue to the issue of race. We can't talk about the South and not talk about race. And so you mentioned that surfing intersected with race in your book. You talk about that, and I think you said something about Black peoples didn't come to the beach to surf or swim. I think that was somewhere in Folly Beach, if I'm not mistaken. But would you like to elaborate a little bit more on surfing and how that to use, I think, a word you used, intersected with the civil rights movement?
Yeah, definitely. The reason that there was a perception that Black people didn't come to the beach to surf or swim, especially I talk about this in the South Carolina chapter. And actually, my students were just asking me last week, I was talking about this book, and my students asked me, well, was that just true in South Carolina? And of course, it was not just true in South Carolina, but each chapter of the book has a theme, and the theme of the South Carolina chapter is race. So, and because I grew up in Charleston, I understood a little bit more the racial politics of the city and the racial history of the city. So in the 60s, there were, famously, there were sit-ins, the Greensboro sit-ins, But there were also wade-ins at the beaches. And so one of the white surfers from Folly Beach in South Carolina that I interviewed said he was surfing on the day of one of these wade-ins. And he remembered being in awe of the Black protesters, that they would risk their lives just to get access to the beach. I mean, he also understood, because he loved the beach, he still loves the beach, the power of the ocean and the power of access to the beach as, liberating. And so why wouldn't all human beings want to have that access and deserve that access? So it was part of the civil rights movement. Some of the beaches in South Carolina and Florida and Los Angeles, as a matter of fact, were segregated during the era of segregation. And so African Americans weren't allowed to go to those beaches. They had their own beach, quote unquote. And in South Carolina, that beach was Mosquito Beach. It was not even an ocean beach. It was just kind of an inlet beach. And as the name suggests, it was mosquito infested. So it was not a very fun place to go if you wanted to spend a lot of time outside and not get bitten. But the good news about this is that after those wade-ins, and as a result of a lot of lawsuits, those segregation fell away. And then African Americans did get more access to the beach and have much more access today. And so one of the people I interviewed was an African American guy named Stone Singleton. He's a lot younger than I am, but so he started surfing in the 2000s, actually. And his dad is a little bit older than me. So he's kind of a half generation younger than me. But yeah, Stone is an incredible surfer still today. He was a longtime lifeguard at Folly Beach, and he's sponsored by the local surf shop. He surfed in Central America. His favorite place to surf is in Costa Rica. So yeah, and one of the things he said about going to Costa Rica to surf, which I thought was really interesting, is it felt liberating to him to surf in this place where there were a lot more people of color that surfed. And that's one of the things that you can definitely say. We were talking about this the first time I met you, about your research and about Nicaraguan surf culture and Costa Rican surf culture. And it's much more diverse in terms of the skin tone of the people who surf. Obviously, those countries are diverse, and so Stone felt really at home in the water because the waves were great and because he didn't look different, quote unquote, from everybody else. So we still have a ways to go for there to be true integration, racial integration in the lineups. That's true in San Francisco where I surf. It's true in Charleston, but things have gotten better.
Yeah, exactly. Let me kind of back up, and this is a more broader question. This isn't specifically about your book, but it's more about our sort of emerging discipline as critical surf study scholars. How does, just considering race, whether it's San Francisco or the South, how can we understand race through the lens of surfing? In other words, why are we using surfing to explore this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm going to do another plug for an author that's a friend of both of ours, Kevin Dawson, who's, I think, going to be on this podcast. And so I won't say too much about his book, but Kevin's book talks about how West Africa had its own surf culture, separate from Hawaii, separate from the United States, and that surf culture in some ways informed the African diaspora, including the American South. And Kevin actually went to the University of South Carolina for his PhD, so he knows South Carolina as well as I do, or anybody. And so that argument is part of why I think looking at surf culture to understand race is important. And the second thing I would say about that is that there is a stereotype about African Americans, and that they, quote unquote, don't swim, or they don't like the water. And Kevin talks about how that's a myth, of course, but he also talks about where that myth comes from, the work that did in American history as plantation owners tried to keep their slaves from learning how to swim so that they couldn't escape, and tried to make them, strip them of that cultural heritage of ocean going and swimming. that had been part of, the coast of Ghana, the coast of Senegal, et cetera, in West Africa. So I think by looking at surfing, by looking at race through the lens of surfing, we can start to question and historicize a lot of the stereotypes that help construct racial difference in the United States. So that's, I think, really why surfing, which seems like a weird lens to look at race, is a really important, and I think has a lot of potential to help reshape the way we think about racial history and racial identity today.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And Kev's book does an incredible job of, like you said, that myth that people from Africa or, African Americans can't swim. I mean, that really, if you, in reading Kevin's book and understanding about the, I would say somewhat robust wave riding culture, they didn't call it surfing, but just the interaction with the ocean really dispels that pretty false narrative about the African American community's relationship with the ocean, or their ability to, or their inability to swim, as some folks suggest or joke about. And so yeah, exactly. Thank you for helping particularly for the listeners, because a lot of us, we speak a very similar language, and there's a lot of assumptions that, well, yeah, of course, we're going to use surfing to explain the agrarian reform in Nicaragua, or tourism, or the pre-transatlantic slave trade. We can look at it through the lens of wave riding. But I think for a lot of our listeners who, some of them may not even be surfers, or some who give that eye roll when I say, well, I'm a historian and I write on surfing. They're like, yeah, dude, you just want to go surf, which is partly true, as we've already confessed. But yeah, thank you for elaborating on that, articulating that, because I think it's important for listeners to understand that we are doing serious history and helping to dispel myths and sort of deconstruct a lot of these racist myths as well. And so I want to I know this is something when you and I met in California, we talked about, but I'd like to get your input on this, sort of on the record, if you will. But I know we've talked about race and some of the plight of the African American community and their quest to, have rights to specific beaches. But I want to look at a more modern day phenomenon, perhaps, and that's how Southern surfers have co-opted the Confederate flag, right? A flag that has a history. It's shrouded in racism and white supremacy. And by no means are all surfers, or, I'm not here to cast judgment on any of the surfers that fly that flag, but it's a flag that is shrouded in heavy white supremacy, particularly on the part of the, post-Civil War Ku Klux Klan. So what was did you interview any of these individuals that were, sort of flying the Confederate flag, that were also surfers? Like, could you just kind of provide me and our listeners with some insight as to how nuanced that is?
Sure. It's a complicated issue, and obviously, like you, I wasn't out to do a gotcha journalism piece here. I didn't want to prove that any of the people I was interviewing were racist and they have all these retrograde ideas. In fact, part of what I was trying to do with this book is show non-Southerners and non-surfers that there's this subculture in the South that helps to dispel a myth about Southernness and Southern whiteness, actually, that you have, vegetarians and tree hugging environmentalists who come from Alabama and what have you. So not everybody was like that. Some people did fit what the mainstream media depicts Southerners as. And so I talked to two people who had worn rebel flag bathing suits. And the first person I interviewed had gone to a surf contest in Alabama. He's from the Space Coast of Florida, from Melbourne Beach, and he just stopped on a lark. He and the surf team that he was on, their van stopped at a roadside stand in Alabama on the way to the contest, and they bought a rebel flag as a joke. And he brought it back to Florida, and his mom sewed it into beach shorts for him, and he wore them again as a joke. And he was aware, even at the time, and this was in the mid to late 1960s, because it was the civil rights movement, because you had all these segregationists and Klansmen using the flag, that it was not the most progressive thing. And for him, it was almost mocking them to wear the bathing suit as a flag, like the same way that hippies wore everything with the American flag on it. The Grateful Dead had the American flag hats and things like that. But on my surf trip this was in 2018, actually, I went to Maryland and surfed in Ocean City. It was the farthest north place I went, and we can debate whether Maryland is still in the South, right? It's north of the Mason, or it's above the Mason-Dixon line. But Maryland was a slave state. Frederick Douglass is from there. Harriet Tubman's from there, and so I was surfing, and there was a younger guy than me. I was about to call him a kid, but he was probably 22 or something. And he paddles up to me on a soft top. And I also had a soft top because I just rented it as the first thing I could grab from the surf shop and go surfing. And for listeners who don't know, when you're riding a soft top, you're just advertising your kookishness. Yeah, of course, now, like, Jamie O'Brien rides a soft top at Pipeline, so he's kind of taken that and flipped it on its head. But most of us who are riding soft tops, it's not the preference. You want to ride a glass board or whatever. So that, I just wanted to set the scene there. So he paddles up to me, and he hadn't caught any waves, and I caught a couple of waves, and I paddled back out, and I said, "Hey, I don't want to get in a fight or anything, but I'm just curious about your bathing suit. Like, where'd you get it, and why are you wearing it?" This wasn't a formal interview. A lot of the interviews I did, most of the interviews I did were formal, I'm going to interview for an hour, but this was just me chatting with another guy in the lineup. And he said, "Well, I'm not from Maryland. I'm from West Virginia," which, note to listeners, has no coastline. And then he said, "I don't even really surf. This is my girlfriend's surfboard, and she just sent me out here to try and learn." And so, part of me was like, I can write this guy off. He's a kook. But I really wanted to know what he thought about the bathing suit, right? Because the idea of a kook in surfing is really relative. Like, I'm a kook compared to Kelly Slater, even though I've been surfing for, as long as 30 plus years. And Kelly Slater is a kook compared to Gabriel Medina, because Gabriel Medina is better than Kelly Slater right now, so it's all relative. If Kelly's listening to this podcast, I don't really think you're a kook, dude. But I just wanted to make a point. So the kid said something really interesting. He said, this bathing suit is a part of my heritage. And I asked him, and I didn't really confront a lot of people about this, but I asked him, well, what if your heritage is seen as hatred by somebody else? How do you balance that? And he said, "Look, I can't tell people how to feel about what I wear and who I am. I just need to be me." And I thought that was an interesting response. It's not the response I would have given, but I thought it was honest. And so that's all I really think. I think when you have a controversial political subject like this, the best thing you can do is have honest conversations, especially with between people who disagree. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I know that's why I wanted to have you, in a sense, elaborate on it, because it's a very nuanced, people have very nuanced reasons, or perhaps even very superficial or simple reasons, like what you were just talking about. But nevertheless, it is something that is, I would say, ubiquitous in the South, the flag, of course. And but I've found, just kind of growing up between Virginia Beach, say in the Outer Banks, that a lot of people will fly it because of its sort of rebellious tone to it. I guess that's probably not the best way to put it, but they feel it's that symbol of rebelliousness that this sort of surfer counterculture vibe embodies as well. And so again, like I said, we could probably do a whole episode on the nuances of why Southern surfers, decide to parade around with the Confederate flag on them or on their automobile or whatever. But yeah, again, thank you for really sharing your research or your interviews in a way that helps highlight this the nuanced nature of something that is highly controversial. I want to segue away from some of the more heavy topics and actually just ask you some fun questions about your experience, because as researchers we get way into the weeds with some of the analyzing gender and class and race, which we should, and that's what we do. But I'd just like to know, what was your favorite surf spot during your trip, and or your best surf session or your most memorable surf session? Where was it?
Thank you. I love talking about that stuff, Jason. It's like we're in the parking lot after a session and just BSing. I think there were three spots that I had a blast surfing. The first was Galveston, and it was actually the first place that my daughter and I surfed together on the trip. And Galveston, Texas is not known for great waves. It's not the best spot on the Gulf Coast of Texas, but we hit it on a pretty good day. It was probably waist high, and we just had a blast. And it was really funny. I talk about this in the book, but we were surfing next to a groin or a fishing pier, and there was a guy blasting Parliament, the funk band, the whole time during our first session there. And so I'll never forget taking off on a wave and hearing Flashlight, the song, come on. And one of the things I love about music and surfing is that it helps cement your memory of certain sessions, and that was definitely one of those. The second place I really loved surfing was Pensacola, Florida, and I didn't expect it to be good, but the morning that we woke up where we had time to surf, my daughter and I got two texts from Pensacola, Florida surfers who I was going to interview later, or who I just interviewed the day before, and they were both like, "Dude, you got to go." And so I went, and it was a blast. It was probably stomach high, not massive, but big for my daughter. And she actually got a little freaked out and went in, and then I just surfed for another hour. I shouldn't admit that, but but I did. It was constantly just one more wave. I'm just going to go in after one more wave, and that one more wave turned into 7 more waves. And then the third place that I had a blast surfing was Ocracoke Island in North Carolina. So for listeners who don't know the Outer Banks very well, Ocracoke is one of the more southern Outer Banks, maybe the most southern of the islands in the Outer Banks. And it is an island where there's no bridge. So you have to take a ferry to get there. And so during the Outer Banks trip, leg of our trip, we were camping the whole time. And the night that we got there, we set up our tents, and the mosquitoes were just voracious. It was so awful. We would jump in our tent and close it, and then kill 10 mosquitoes on the inside of the tent. There's just blood everywhere. It was like a massacre. But the next morning, I woke up earlier than everybody else, and I grabbed one of my buddy's boards who lives in North Carolina and went out and just had such an amazing session, literally by myself. I was the only person surfing on the whole island. And one of the things about surfing in the South that you rarely see, at least in California, from San Francisco south to the Mexico border, is a beach that is completely empty and it's just you. And that happens in the South, and it is magical. So that was my favorite session. And then of course, my buddy came out, and my daughter and his daughter came out, and we had a great time together. But that was the most magical session. So thanks for asking about that.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad the Outer Banks made your list, because, growing up and surfing those places, cruising when I had a Volkswagen van again, and, we would just park and it'd just be all of us surfing, Rodanthe or wherever it may be, Pea Island, and just massive stretches of beach, and it's just you out there. So it is a magical place. It's a beautiful place. I've never surfed Ocracoke, so now I got to add that to my list. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. And because I think your book isn't just a great history or viewing these issues of gender, race, and whatnot through the lens of surfing, but it's actually just an enjoyable read. It's a fun and easy read for, say, non-academics. And so I'm really grateful that you took the time to do your surf trip and actually write about it. And so with that, Steve, I want to go ahead and give you the last word.
Well, I'll say again, Jason, thanks so much for having me on the podcast and just doing the podcast, because I think it's really important that surfers know that there is such a thing as critical surf studies. That I love talking with other surfers about, the joy of surfing, but I'm a historian too, and as you are, and a scholar, and I want other surfers to think a little bit deeply about what we do and why we do it, and the impacts of what we do and how on society and culture and the environment. And so I basically, my last word is just to say thank you for having me on and for letting me talk about the book. And it was a blast to do the book, and I was totally stoked to be on the podcast. So thanks, man.
If you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Steve Estes, I'd like to invite you to check out the next episode, where I'll be interviewed about my research on the history of surfing in Nicaragua by friend and producer of the Surfing Historian, Taylor Ramon. We figured that the second season was a good time to finally talk in depth about my research. So we hope you're as stoked as we are about this upcoming episode. Taylor and I will chat about the first surfers to surf in Nicaragua, as well as the political and economic conditions that fostered an environment welcoming for surf tourism and surf settler colonialism, a phenomenon that subsequently aided in the proliferation of a robust local Nicaraguan surfing subculture. Although I am perhaps a bit biased, I'm certain that this will be an episode you won't want to miss. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Surfing Historian. If you're stoked on these conversations, be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. And don't forget to check out our killer merch at surfinghistorian.com. Proceeds go to help keep this amazing podcast going strong. Until next time, stay stoked.